Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. We're continuing the station of Samaa, and Ibn Qayyim here takes a related tangent, and it's a very important one as well. Now, if you remember last week, we spoke about the issue of music and how music in general, generally speaking, has a negative impact on the health of our iman, because music really, it's about promoting, certain behaviors that are either inconsistent with the principles of the Quran, or they are inconsistent with the person, him or herself. That the singer is talking about things that they won't do, or they're contradicting themselves. One time they're singing about this, the next time they're singing about something completely opposite of that, and how that creates hypocrisy. Now, some people will accompany their worship with music, right? Other religions, maybe even sometimes in certain strands of Muslim sects, you will find that music holds a very important place in rituals, where they'll take music and they start dancing, or they start doing some sort of unified, I don't want to call it a ritual, unified dance, whatever you want to call it. And they feel the spiritual, quote-unquote, high because of that. And we touched on this a little bit, but Ibn Qayyim presents certain principles and rules that can help guide us in this regard. And he's now specifically addressing certain Sufi groups who use music, right, and just use music as a religious practice and justify the use by the claim that it makes them feel spiritually close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Ibn Qayyim gives us 3 rules, right? How do we navigate this? And the first rule is that al-dhawq mahkum la hakim. Dhawq, now the word dhawq literally means to taste. And this is actually, you find this in remnants even in Western spiritual sciences, that they refer to it as experiencing certain principles of the faith, right? Experiencing God, experiencing love. In Islam, or the Sufi groups, they call this dhawq, right? And it comes from the hadith, ذَاقَ طَعْمَ الْإِيمَانِ مَنْ رَضِيَ بِاللَّهِ رَبًّا وَبِالْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا وَبِمُحَمَّدٍ نَبِيًّا وَرَسُولًا. The person will taste iman. A person tastes iman, the one who is pleased with Allah and is pleased with Islam and is pleased with the Prophet as their messenger and as their prophet, or pleased with Muhammad as their messenger and prophet. And when you look at the explanation of this hadith, the scholars say that there's a taste. You can actually feel it, right? Just like when you eat something, right, you taste it. And part of the experience of eating is actually tasting it. If it tastes good, it's a good experience. If it tastes bad, it's a bad experience. In fact, I was at a macaroons place at the mall, and there was one specific macaroon that's packaged. And I didn't know why it was packaged. I figured it was probably some allergy reasons, so they package it. And then it turns out that it uses the fruit, I forgot what it's called, Durant something. It basically is a very, very smelly fruit. And they sell it at Ralph's. Yeah. It has, it's small, it's like this, and it has like spikes coming all out of it, right? But it's a very smelly fruit. So that's why they package it, because it has a bad smell. Now for some people, that's just, they can't bear it, right? Same thing like sushi. Sushi, if it's not your style, I mean, it's just a bad experience. You never want to do it again. So flavor indicates your experience, or heavily impacts your experience. Same thing with iman. If you have a good experience with iman, it helps keep you in that fold. But if you have a bad experience with religion in general, or religious people, I should say, then that can lead to a completely different route. And a lot of people who become like anti-Muslims and apostates and whatnot, some of them have gone through very, very traumatic experiences as a child, right? When you look at some of these people, when they were young, they were in some sort of country, and the country, their parents sent them to a madrasa, and the teacher was abusive, whipping them and slapping them, and putting them through what we would consider today some forms of torture, right? And then it creates a monster, right? whose sole purpose in life becomes to discredit Muslims and to destroy Islam. Right? So they tasted a very bad, or their experience was very bad, and left a bitter and bad taste in their mouths. So tasting iman, right, is not independent, and the taste doesn't. This is now the rule. The taste doesn't determine whether it's permissible in Islam or not. Meaning, just because something feels good does not make it halal. Just because something feels good does not mean it is good. Right? This is what Ibn Qayyim is saying. Rather, the taste is ruled by, or is judged, not ruled. Taste is judged and not the ruler. Right? Taste is the one being judged and not the one judging. I'm trying to put it in different words to get the point across. Right? In other words, just because something tastes good does not make it good. Rather, we need to go to an outside source, an external source, to determine whether this is good or not. Right? And that is, of course, the Quran and Sunnah. So just because, listening to certain music makes your heart feel soft and it sheds a tear and you feel, or makes you feel more energetic and, puts that courage or that enthusiasm in your heart, say, yes, I want to go home and, pray 2 rakahs for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does not make it necessarily a good thing, right? This is what Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah is saying. Rather, we need to go back to Quran and Hadith to determine whether this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with or not, right? And to give you an example, right? And before the example, we tend to have a fallacy in the way we understand things, and that is, if we enjoy it, it automatically means Allah likes it, right? And that's not the case. Let me give you an example, right? Someone loves a cat very much. They have a cat and they love it very much. And this individual, this person really likes gummy bears, let's say. And they love gummy bears. And because they love gummy bears so much and they love the cat, they want to feed the cat gummy bears. I love this, right? And I love you. So therefore, I'm going to give you what I love, the gummy bears. Now, just because that person loves gummy bears, does it mean it's suitable for the cat? Not at all. Just because we love something does not mean someone else loves it as well, right? So just because we enjoy, we might enjoy dancing, we might enjoy listening to certain melodies, does not make it pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We please Allah the way He tells us to please Him. He is the one who determines what's pleasing to Him, not us. Just like the cat has a certain nature, that nature determines whether or not it likes something or not. Right? We can't force it to like something just because we think it's good. Right? So that's the first rule. So we look to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger to determine whether something is good or not, and we look to nothing else, not our hearts, not to other people, not to cultural practices, not to what's accepted by the norm, not what celebrities say, and not what TV wants us to believe, etc. The second rule is that يجب الرجوع إلى الحجة المقبولة عند الله وعند عباده المؤمنين. That we must go back to the arguments that are acceptable to Allah and the believers, right? Meaning, now we have the first rule, and that is we need to find something is good based on Quran and Sunnah. Quran and Sunnah determine whether or not something is good. Now, someone might go back to Quran and Sunnah and say, okay, here you go, I have evidence that this is good, right? Now, any science will have its own methodology. And based on that methodology, it helps navigate arguments. Is this an acceptable argument or not? Right? Is this a reasonable or an applicable argument or not? What are the sources? How do we understand them? How do we apply them? Etc. Right? So the mind is a source for understanding. Right? It's the main source for reasoning as well. Now, someone might look at the sky and say, the sky is blue. Right? I believe the sky is blue because there must be some mirrors outside of the earth, the atmosphere, that's blue and it's reflecting on the sky, and that's what's making it blue, right? Now, my mind is a source of intelligence. is my argument acceptable? I made an argument for why the sky is blue, right? Is that an acceptable argument? Okay, now you have to ask me, okay, what are you basing your conclusion off of, right? And I'm gonna say my mind perceives it that way. Great, right? Allah preserve your mind. That's not an acceptable argument, right? That's not an acceptable source to build an argument off of or to come to a conclusion. There must be something. For psychology, it is tests. They do surveys, they do tests to try and find a pattern, to try and find a consistent conclusion, right? Based on our tests of, let's say, marriage and divorce, we find that money plays a very important role to the success of or let's say a financial stability. I think that's a more appropriate word. Financial stability plays an important role to the success of a marriage, right? How did you come to that conclusion? Well, based on 1,000 studies, right, we found a consistent result that financial stability plays an important role. Right? That's an acceptable argument. Does that make sense? So same thing when it comes to Quran and Hadith. Just because someone interprets a verse a certain way does not make it an argument, does not make it an acceptable argument, right? There are ways of deciphering what's acceptable versus what's unacceptable, what's equivocal versus what's unequivocal, meaning what's clear-cut versus what's not clear-cut. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to pray, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ, pray, and there are tens, if not hundreds, of verses and hadith that are commanding us to pray, right? Are we going to say that salah is a command? We are commanded to pray? Well, that's a very clear argument. The Quran is consistently, constantly making it clear to us that prayer is very important, right? When you add to that the consequences of someone who doesn't pray versus the reward of someone who does pray, well, it's very severe. So now you say, okay, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ascribed major reward and severe consequences to prayer, now we find that, okay, this must have a very important place in salah, right? So, like that is an acceptable argument. Now, someone who comes and says, قُلْ بِفَضْلِ اللَّهِ وَبِرَحْمَتِهِ فَبِذَلِكَ فَلْيَفْرَحُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Yunus, say, by the bounty of Allah and His mercy, for those two things, a person should find or should celebrate, right? Celebrate Allah's mercy and His bounties. Right? Now I've heard someone come and say that this is evidence that we should be dancing, right? Because celebrating and dancing go hand in hand, right? Now, does the verse clearly indicate this? Now, are there other ways of celebrating beyond dancing, right? And, did the Prophet ﷺ start dancing when this verse was revealed to him? I don't know of a single hadith where the Prophet ﷺ danced, right? Does it make sense? So they'll take a verse and they'll somehow, twist and turn it and, make it fit a certain understanding when that's not the case. Now, they tried using their mind to come to a rational conclusion, but their conclusion is unacceptable because the argument that they use is not consistent. It doesn't work, right? So we must go back to the acceptable arguments, right? That which is acceptable to Allah and to the believers. Now, why does He say the believers? Because in Islam, as you know, in the Muslims, they have this concept of consensus, right? Unanimous opinion, where if all the scholars agree to an opinion, then that opinion is binding and it becomes clear cut. Okay, why? Because of two things. Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised to preserve the Quran. Right? He says this in the Quran, and part of preserving the Quran is preserving the meanings of the Quran as well. Right? It's not just about the words. Allah preserves the words in a sense that we are reciting the same Quran that was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. But part of that preservation is preserving the understanding and the meanings. Right? So, based on the promise of Allah, the correct understanding of each and every single verse and hadith must be present in the Muslim Ummah, even if that presence is a minority. Does that make sense? But if all the believers agree to something, right, then it indicates that that is what was meant by the hadith or by the verse. Why? Because Allah promised to preserve it. Now, if all the Muslims or all the scholars agree to an opinion, right, that is contrary to the correct understanding of the Quran, that means there is part of the Quran, even if it's one verse, right, that wasn't preserved. Does that make sense? So this is why consensus is accepted and a part of the epistemology of Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh, right? The other argument is that where was I going with this? We said the Quran. I'm sorry. The Quran. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala promised to preserve the Quran. Okay, I forgot the other one where I was going with this, but that's why he says the believers, right? What is acceptable to the believers is an acceptable argument. The second thing is that it is borderline. It's so difficult for such a diverse group of people from different lands who were trained differently when it comes to the Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh, right? To all agree on something. Now, if we were to talk about any issue here, right, and we are in a small group of people, it will be very difficult to find one issue that we all agree on. Now, how about when we do agree on something? Well, that kind of gives you that sense of, you know what, this seems to be the right thing, right? So when you have the Malikis and the Hanafis, who very much differ when it comes to how do we come to a correct understanding of Quran and Hadith, they very much differ. But if they agree on something, despite that diversity, that plurality, right? I mean, that's an indication that what they are assessing is clear, right? So when the Muslims agree upon something, there's unanimous consent. It indicates to the fact that what they are agreeing upon is clear cut as well, right? Because they're not going to agree upon something that's not clear cut. Does that make sense? Because this is a part of Islamic jurisprudence, a source of fiqh that people try and attack, right? Say, oh, it's impossible for this to happen. Oh, this is nonsense and all. No, I mean, when you think about it, it's so hard to come about that if it does come about, that's a pretty clear indication that this is the right opinion, the correct opinion. That's the second rule. The third rule is that if there is no clear-cut argument to be made, there are no clear-cut evidences, then we go to one of the fundamental principles of fiqh, and that is the principle of good versus harm, weighing the good versus the harm. The Sharia in its entirety came for the purpose of bringing us good and protecting us from harm, right? So you find the Sharia in its entirety does precisely this, whether it's acts of worship or whether it's our human engagements on the business level, the marital level, the family level, the personal level. All of it comes to bring the good to you and protect you from the harm. So if there is a certain issue that's not clear, and there are many issues that aren't clear. For example, the organ donation, right? This isn't a clear issue. I mean, I personally haven't come across a verse that alludes to this or a hadith that alludes to this. I'm sure there's somewhere in the books of fiqh, you have to dig really deep to find it, somewhere where there's some sort of issue that we can use to better understand the issue of organ donating. But until then, how do we understand this? Well, we go back to this principle. Let us measure the good versus the harm. What are the goods and what are the harms? The good is that you are helping someone else to live, right? The harm is that, you are in a way kind of harming your body. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, dignified the human body and gave it nobility, and cutting it up and taking parts out, that kind of degrades that, takes away from that nobility. This is how we look at it. So you have these two. The good is that you're saving a person's life or helping them live more efficiently, and the harm is that you are transgressing the nobility or the dignity of a human body. And that's important, by the way, in Islam. right? وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we've given dignity to the human being. The body is something dignified in Islam. That's why there's so much of the Sharia of Hadith that talks about hygiene, how to take care of yourself, what to wear, type of clothing, how to present yourself. Why? Because we are a dignified creation. If we take that dignity away, as the Prophet ﷺ says, إِن لَمْ تَسْتَحِي فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. If you don't have timidness, if the characteristic of shyness is dead in a person, they'll do whatever they want. This is one of the interpretations. They'll do anything. And you see this. Right? When you look at, Hollywood and some of the things they present and they show, right? That's not even 1% of what's out there. When you go into other industries that are more crude and more lewd. So if the person loses their dignity, they'll do anything. They'll eat dead people. That's just the reality. I'm not saying out of starvation. I'm saying out of, hey, this is actually pretty good. This is a good thing to do, right? So human dignity is important. So how do we weigh this? Well, yes, human dignity is important, but saving a life is also more important, right? And we're talking about after death. So a person dies and they take an organ out of the body. Yeah, it's kind of degrading the body, but not too much, right? It's not completely desecrating the body. But rather now we're taking something that person no longer needs and assisting someone else in living. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. And whoever saves a life, that it's as if they saved all of mankind. So this is how we weigh it. So if you're looking at something, you're not sure, look at it. What good is coming out of this versus what bad is coming out of this? And this requires research, by the way, right? It's not something that we can just logically discern and come to a conclusion to just using our mind and quickly, analyzing the situation. No, this requires research. Let us research the benefits of music versus the harms of music. All right, let's research the benefit of television versus the harm of television. Smartphones, the benefit versus the harms, and then let's determine our route based on that. Okay, so those are the three principles Ibn Qayyim says when it comes to feelings. Whether a feeling is good or not needs to go through these three filters before we come to a conclusion whether or not this is something that we should practice or not. Now, continuing as-Samaa, listening, the station of listening, Abu Ismail al-Harawi rahimahullah ta'ala says, السماع على ثلاثة درجات سماع العامة وهو ثلاثة أشياء إجابة زجر الوعيد رغبة وإجابة دعوة الوعد جهدا وبلوغ مشاهدة المنة استبصارا. Excuse me. Abu Ismail al-Harawi rahimahullah ta'ala says that the station of listening has three levels. Again, the three levels, and with each level comes three elements. The level of the average Muslim, and there are three elements here. Ijabatu zajr al-wa'idi raghbatan. Answering the zajr is when you do something to prevent someone. Right? You tell them something to try and prevent them from doing something else. Right? So answering the threat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's meant to prevent us from doing something, raghbatan, out of hope. So, very interesting word usage here. And it's powerful, by the way, because it helps us really in our times today when people are all about what I want to do and what's correct is what I believe to be correct. It's really good to analyze it from this sense because it gives you the various elements of how these important aspects of the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's discussion with us through the Quran works. So when we listen to the Quran, part of that listening needs to be in order with the intention to answer the threats or to be impacted by the threats of Allah out of hope of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have these two things, these two important critical elements of Iman, that is khawf and raja, fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are two fundamental elements of the heart and a person's attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, part of believing in Allah, part of having a healthy relationship with Allah is to fear Him. Right? Now people look at this very negatively today. Oh, what kind of a dictator, authoritarian is this? He's trying to make us afraid. Well, yeah, for a reason, right? That is because fear has such a powerful impact on our behavior. Very powerful. Remember, I think I mentioned last week, when we talk about these emotions, right? The heart is the vessel of emotions. Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so concerned with the heart? Because these emotions impact our behavior. So the Quran comes to discipline those emotions so that each and every one of them is utilized in a way that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is healthy to be afraid for your children because there are threats out there. If you're not afraid for your children, you become careless. That's just the reality, right? Oh, don't worry about it. Just go walk around the city. Go ahead, take the train at the age of 12 and go to Los Angeles, spend the day and come back. You're okay. I won't even give you money because everything is A-okay. What would we say about such a person? I mean, they're careless. Child services will probably come and threaten that person. That if you do that again, we will take away your child, right? Why? Because that person has lost the sense of fear for their child. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is afraid for us, right? Or I should reword that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala strikes fear in our heart to protect us. This is how we use fear. Fear is a good thing, right? Because it protects us. And there are books about this, right? How fear is such a positive emotion. We don't enjoy it, but it's positive. And I remember one person gave me an analogy. He's a physician. He said that pain is a good thing. Pain is a very good thing because pain is signaling to your brain something is wrong. Check it out. That's how pain works. There's a wisdom behind it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created pain, right? Fear is also an indicator. For mothers especially, this thing is on par for you guys, right? For the mother, she can fear. She has this kind of a premonition where she senses something is going to go wrong before it happens, right? Call it's a sixth sense, right? Call it something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the mother to assist her in taking care of her child, but it's there for a reason. And mothers are almost always right? That's how they say. They're almost always right. But that's there for a reason. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, He puts fear in our heart. Fear of punishment, fear of the day of judgment, fear of the hellfire. Because these are very important things. If we lose that fear, right, then people will do whatever they want. And they will go astray, and they will lead themselves to destruction. If a person isn't afraid of the negative consequences of smoking, that's a bad thing. That's a very bad thing, right? So we answer the threats of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We allow ourselves to be transformed and impacted by the threats of Allah out of hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will assist us in staying away from these things. Because it is fundamental to our happiness to stay away from these things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He says, for example, do not fornicate, there is severe punishment in this life and the next life for fornication, right? Allah is striking that fear in our hearts. Why? Because fornication leads to so many societal harms, right? So many, not just societal harms, even mental illnesses or mental harms, psychological harms. It leads to the destruction of society, destruction of family, right? And I've mentioned the statistics before. 30% of children who live in a single parent home develop either social deviance, meaning they fall into crime, or they develop mental illnesses. 30%. These are big numbers. How many millions of children and youth in America are being raised in single parent homes? How many? Right? I'm not talking about divorce, right? I'm talking about one of the parents is missing from the life of that person. That is very, very problematic. This is something we should be afraid of, right? So when we answer the threats of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do not fornicate, right? There are severe consequences. It's out of hope that staying away from this will not only bring us closer to Allah, get us closer to paradise, but it'll also lead to a healthy and happy life, right? There's that hope element here. It's not just fear, because when it becomes unbalanced, it can lead to problems as well, by the way. If someone is just afraid of Allah, everything is fear of Allah, I'm so afraid, it becomes a type of, the person develops like a schizophrenia, right? This type of fear of things that aren't even there. Waswas, they call it in Arabic language. And I think even in other languages, waswas, where the person is pretty much has thoughts in their mind that it's uncontrollable. That can happen when there's too much fear. And the scholars of fiqh spoke about this. Even the Prophet ﷺ spoke about this. Oh, I'm afraid that I didn't make wudu correctly. Oh, I'm afraid that I'm not praying right. Oh, I'm afraid I'm not doing this right. I mean, I've gotten some emails that are, I cannot help but say that this person is borderline mentally insane. In fact, one scholar was asked by someone. He said, the questioner asked, he said, sometimes I take a swim, right, after having a relationship with my wife for ghusl, meaning my entire body was in a pool of water, right? And I come out, but I'm not certain that I fulfilled ghusl. I fulfilled major ablution. So the scholar answered, don't worry about it, you don't need to pray. The questioner was confused, don't worry about it, you don't need to pray. Why don't I need to pray? Because you are at a state where your mind has overpowered you. You have lost the ability to keep your mind in check, to where you are now borderline insane. Because someone who feels like water didn't reach their entire body after jumping in a pool of water, that they have a problem that needs to be checked. Does that make sense? Right? So this can be very dangerous if it's all about the fear. There's fear and there's hope. I am afraid of Allah's punishment, but I implement it and I abide by it out of hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to reward me for that. Keep it balanced. The second element of this level of listening, ijabatu da'watil wa'di jahdan, right, is answering the call of the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with all your energy. So answering the threats of Allah, and also answering the call of the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Paradise is for those who pray and give zakah. Paradise is for those who do good for others. Paradise is for those who are honest. Paradise is for those who are kind with other people. Right? Answering that call with all your energy. Putting it all out there. I'm going to spend every ounce of energy I have in order to do this. Why? Because it has that connection. Right? It shows that the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has such a large place in the person's heart, right? That it affects even the smallest of their actions. And the Prophet ﷺ says, لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا ولو أن تلقى أخاك بوجه بشوش. Do not underestimate, do not look down upon even the smallest good deeds, even the smallest favors, right? Even if that favor is to see a fellow person, a fellow Muslim, or walk by them with a smiling face. So minute, right? I mean, we do that and it becomes almost customary, at least here in the West. In the east part of America, it's a different story. But it's customary. But it has a major impact. The Prophet ﷺ is telling us, do not underestimate that. Do not look down upon it. In other hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that, give a gift to your neighbor or for someone else, even if that gift is a pot of soup with a bone in it and the broth of meat or chicken, right? Now, to us, that's something, we'd feel embarrassed to do that. Now, back in their day, they don't have the luxuries of food that we have today, so kind of understand, right? I'm not saying take a bowl of beef broth with a piece of bone in it and give it to. What I'm saying is that that's not something significant, right? It's not something that's going to bring joy, bring us happiness and fill the stomach. But it is something, at least for that time, even if it's minute. Going to your neighbor and saying, what, I have a box of chocolate. And I bought myself a box of chocolate and I said, what, let me buy one for my neighbor. And something very simple, right? It goes a long way. It really does go a long way. So when the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, He promises us certain promises, put all your energy, right, into trying to answer that promise. And the third element is بلوغ مشاهدة المنة استبصارا. What is meant by this is to remind the listener. When you are listening, right, remember that as you are listening, remember that all the favors, all the good, all the bounties that you have received, you are receiving, and you potentially will receive is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So when we listen to the threats of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, or we listen to the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, we have in our consciousness, right, as we listen to this, we are simultaneously remembering that my ability to answer the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to adhere to the threats of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a blessing in of itself from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? See, sometimes this is probably a mistake in 99.9% of Muslims, right? When they are trying to understand the Quran, they are sincere in their want and their yearning of applying the Quran. But what happens is they start depending on their own abilities, right? They start saying, okay, yes, when I'm done with this, the Quran tells me to do this, I'm going to go and I'm going to start doing that, right? And then they try doing it and then they fall short. You know, people say, yes, I'm going to start praying. You know, I believe in these verses. I'm going to start praying my 5 daily prayers on time. And they start for a day or two and then they stop, right? There is a trap here by the shaitan. And that is to try and convince the person that it is your abilities, it is you yourself who needs to apply this. And they forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you pray 5 times a day, on time, that is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If He wants to take it away from you, He can. If He wants to give you more, He can, right? So, this is not to say that we sit down and just wait for the calling, right? And the guidance to kind of magically come to our heart. No, it's to make sure that when we are listening, when we try to apply Islam, we remember in ourselves that it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gives us tawfiq. So when we try to pursue, we say, oh Allah, I need you to help me with this. If you leave me to myself, I will fail. Right? And those who say the adhkar of the mornings and the evenings, one of the adhkar is وَلَا تَكِلْنِي إِلَى نَفْسِي طَرْفَةَ عَيْنٍ. Do not leave me to myself for a blink of an eye. Right? This is the Prophet ﷺ teaching us this and saying this every single day, twice a day. Do not leave me to myself for a blink of an eye. Right? And to kind of put this into perspective, maybe we've all had the experience when we were driving, we were that close to coming to an accident. Maybe if the fault is our own or the fault is someone else. This close, right? Driving 70 miles an hour on the highway, this close, right? That was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who, at that millisecond, put in your brain the right action, right? He is the one who assisted you in that moment. But we always need that assistance, regardless of whether the situation is dire or not, right? So even coming to this lecture, for example, listening to this lecture, that is a bounty, a minnah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a gift, a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He is the one who is giving us that. And therefore when we do it, we need to have the wisdom, because Abu Ismail says, al-minnah is istibsaran, right? It's coming from the word insight. Part of insight is realizing this, that it wasn't me who got myself to my iman, the level of iman that I have, right? Nor is it me who's going to push the boundaries of my iman to where it becomes stronger. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who could bless me with that. I will act, I will adhere to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but I must simultaneously, right, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me the tawfiq in order to continue doing what I do and to increase what I do. Right? This is an important element of iman that we fall short of really doing. And you have some quotes from our pious predecessors, among which is Ibn Adam la tadri ayyul min ni'mati. Oh, before that, this is another interesting point, and that is recognizing that blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do not equate necessarily to happiness or joy. Meaning, a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can come in a form of stress, can come in the form of physical pain. It can come in the form of poverty, right? Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no reason to punish us except if punishment is going to get us closer to paradise, closer to Him. There's no reason to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this in the Quran, مَا يَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ بِعَذَابِكُمْ إِن شَكَرْتُمْ وَآمَنْتُمْ. What is Allah going to benefit, subhanahu wa ta'ala, from punishing you if you are believers and you are grateful? Meaning, punishment comes if we are failing in terms of our iman, or we are failing or lacking in terms of our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they're very much heavily linked. And I think we've spoken about gratitude, how that works, and we'll get to it eventually, I believe. So, whether or not what we are experiencing at a particular moment we perceive to be positive or not, does not mean it's negative or not, or does not mean it's negative, right? Experiencing something negative does not necessarily mean it's negative. Experiencing something positive does not mean it's something positive. When we're talking about Islam and our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And based on that, you have these quotes, one of which is, يَبْنَ آدَمْ لا تدري أي النعمتين عليك أفضل نعمته فيما أعطاك أو نعمته فيما زوي عنك. O child of Adam, you don't know which of the two blessings is better for you. The blessing of what Allah has given you, or the blessing of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has withheld from you. You don't know which of the two is better. We really don't, right? Because we might think this job is better for me, but it's not. And we might think this job is worse for me, but it's not. And this even goes to the realm of marriage. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِن كَرِهْتُمُوهُنَّ فَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَيَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ فِيهِ خَيْرًا عَظِيمًا خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that about spouses, right? Perhaps you might despise your spouse or some aspects of your spouse, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it a lot of good, right? And the Prophet ﷺ says that if there's something in your spouse that you don't like, there's something else in your spouse that you do like. Keep it balanced. Now, this is not saying if someone is in an abusive relationship that they accept it, say, oh, there must be a lot of good. That's not what I'm saying here. We're talking about normal, disagreements that aren't transgressing the red lines or the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as physical abuse. But you might not know in something is good or not. And therefore, it goes back to this idea of minna, right? And having that dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We put our dependence on Allah that He is going to choose for us that which is better for us. And this, the pious predecessors would be more excited if Allah didn't answer their dua versus if they did. Or let me rephrase that. When a person makes dua, they're asking for something specific. Oh Allah, I need this job, right? I want this job. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might answer and help that person obtain that job. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might choose a different path for that person. The pious predecessors would be happier if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answered their dua not by giving them what they specifically asked for, but something else. Why? Because they would say, if Allah answered the dua I asked for, that means I asked for it. I'd rather have what Allah chose for me rather than what I chose for myself. Right? And in Umar radiallahu anh is quoted as saying, لا أبالي على أي حال أصبحت أو أمسيت إن كان الغنى إن فيه للشكر إن فيه للشكر وإن كان الفقر إن فيه للصبر. Umar radiallahu anh says that it doesn't matter to me in what state I'm in at night or in the morning. If it's financial stability, I have the wealth, then I am thankful and grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. But if it is poverty or financial instability, then there is patience. Meaning, Umar radiallahu anh understood and was living by the idea, the belief that my purpose in life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And my financial state does not impact that in the least. Quite the contrary. If I am wealthy and well off, I am grateful to Allah and I worship Allah through that gratitude, and it's bringing me closer to Allah. Therefore, I have met my purpose. Right? But if it's poverty, then I will worship Allah through patience, and therefore I am getting closer to Allah through my poverty, right? And that is fulfilling my purpose. So it doesn't matter to me which state I am in. Now again, this doesn't mean we sit around and do nothing, right? And say, oh, I am thankful for what Allah has given me, or I am patient. Sometimes we inflict our punishments with our own hands. That's not what's meant here. But sometimes things are out of our hands. That's just the reality. Therefore, we are able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala despite our state. Abu Ismail al-Harawi rahimahullah ta'ala now says, سماع الخاصة على ثلاثة أشياء شهود المقصود في كل رمز والوقوف على الغاية في كل حين والخلاص من التلذذ بالتفرق. The second level, the level of the above average, the three elements are as follows. شهود المقصود في كل رمز is to observe. Remember this word observing? Mushahada and maqsood. We are observing Iman. We are observing the Quran in the world around us. The Quran isn't just something that we observe in a book written down. Rather, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us something, we see that in the world around us. So we observe and we witness the presence of every symbol. This is how it's worded. I'm trying to translate as best as possible. What's meant by symbol here is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His names and His attributes. And that is when we look at, when we hear something, right? We are here, of course, we might hear the Quran. When we hear the Quran, right, the above average Muslims are able to convert what they hear into experiences. In other words, they're able to convert what they are hearing from the Quran to an experience of Iman and an engagement with the physical world around them, right? Especially when it comes to Allah's names and attributes. When you look at anything, even the Quran has this style, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the natural world, the events that go on, He very consistently concludes these verses by mentioning or invoking His names and attributes, right? Allah did this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Qawiyyun Aziz. He's all powerful and almighty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Alimun Hakim. He's all knowledgeable, He's all wise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did this, He is Ghaniyun Hamid. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is self-sufficient and He is praiseworthy. Why? Because these physical creations are the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah, being the author of the creation, expresses who He is through His creation. Right? So when we listen to the Quran, right, we convert what we are listening to this experience of Iman, to where now the world around, or the Quran is helping us understand the world around us through these symbols. The clouds are a symbol of Allah's abilities. The mountains are a symbol of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom and His might. The rain is a symbol of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and His generosity. Snow is a symbol of this. Does that make sense? So when we listen, we convert what we are listening to into an actual experience. And to do this, right, in order to fully engage this observance or this conversion, we need to do four things. We need to do Samaa, billah, walillah, wa fillahi, wa min Allah. Right? So we need to listen. See, this is so hard to translate. We need to listen by Allah, for Allah, for the sake of Allah and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we'll get into that next week, inshallah, because there's some things to say and we'll go way too overboard or over time. So let's stop there, inshallah. Next week we will continue this idea of listening for the sake of Allah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by Allah. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.